I'd like to state for the record that I don't believe in ghosts. I didn't then, and even after everything that happened at Harrigan Gorge, I'm still not sure what I believe. What I can tell you is what I saw, what I heard, and what the rules were designed to prevent. Whether you call it supernatural or simply unexplained, the distinction didn't matter much when I was standing alone in that yard at 3 in the morning, watching something that shouldn't exist try to finish a journey it started before I was born. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 27 years old, and until last March, I worked in a warehouse outside Boise, moving pallets and driving forklifts for slightly above minimum wage. When the company downsized, I found myself scrolling through job listings with increasing desperation, my savings account dwindling with each passing week. That's when I saw the posting. Night locomotive technician, Harrigan Gorge Maintenance Depot, Central Idaho. Competitive pay, minimal supervision. Experience preferred but not required. The pay was almost double what I'd been making. The isolation didn't concern me. I'd grown up in rural Montana, and the idea of quiet nights working around trains actually appealed to me. There's something honest about machinery, something predictable, or so I thought. The drive to Harrigan Gorge took 3 hours from Boise, the last 40 minutes on increasingly narrow roads that wound through dense pine forest and along the edge of a river canyon so deep I couldn't see the bottom. The depot itself sat in a wide bowl carved between mountains, a long scar of steel and gravel that stretched for nearly a mile. Multiple parallel tracks gleamed in the afternoon sun, lined with parked locomotives and endless strings of freight cars, hoppers, tankers, boxcars, flatbeds, all sitting silent and massive, their shadows long across the ballast. At the far end of the yard, the main line disappeared into a tunnel mouth bored straight into the mountain, a perfect black circle framed by concrete. At the near end, the tracks converged onto a steel trestle bridge that spanned the canyon, the metal framework looking delicate from this distance, like a spider web stretched across the gorge. Between these 2 points lay the yard, a maintenance shop with corrugated metal siding, a small control shack with windows overlooking the tracks, fuel stations, tool sheds, and that overwhelming sense of industrial purpose temporarily at rest. During the day, the place was alive with noise, diesel engines rumbling, air brakes hissing, the metallic clang of tools against steel, voices crackling over radios. But I arrived at 6 in the evening for my first shift orientation, and already the day crew was packing up, and the quality of sound was changing. The wind that funneled through the canyon made every loose chain rattle, every uncoupled car creak and groan as the metal contracted in the cooling air. My supervisor was Roy Matheson, a man in his late 50s with the kind of deep tan lines you only get from decades of outdoor work. Pale forehead where his hard hat sits, weathered face below. His hands were scarred and calloused, and he moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste motion around heavy machinery. He didn't smile much, but he wasn't unfriendly, just focused. "You know anything about locomotives?" he asked, leading me between 2 massive units, their noses pointed toward each other like sleeping giants. "Not much," I admitted, "but I'm good with mechanical systems. I learn fast." He nodded, neither impressed nor disappointed. For the next 4 hours, he walked me through the basics, checking brake lines for leaks, inspecting wheel assemblies for cracks, climbing up into cold locomotive cabs to test batteries and log unit numbers, verifying fuel levels and documenting everything on clipboards that would be reviewed by the day shift supervisor. It was methodical work, slightly tedious but not difficult. The kind of job where attention to detail mattered more than speed. The other members of the night crew were friendly enough. A couple of mechanics, a track inspector, a brakeman named Ty who seemed perpetually amused by some private joke. They all left by 11:30, trucks and cars crunching down the gravel access road until their tail lights disappeared into the trees. By midnight, the yard was empty except for me. Well, almost empty. Before Roy left, he brought me back to the control shack, a cramped room that smelled like burnt coffee and diesel fumes with windows overlooking the main tracks and a computer console that monitored the automated systems. He handed me a weathered clipboard with a laminated sheet clipped to it, the edges worn soft from handling. "Night shift safety rules," he said. "Read them before you start your rounds. Company policy." I glanced at the sheet, expecting the usual. Wear your hard hat, use proper lockout procedures, report all injuries, don't operate equipment while impaired. Those were all there, printed in standard corporate font. But scattered between them in the same font and formatting were other rules that made my eyebrows rise. Rule 3. Do not walk between coupled cars after 1:37 a.m., even if all units are shut down and brakes are set. Rule 5. If you observe a locomotive headlight in the canyon but hear no engine noise, do not stand near the tracks. Rule 7. When crossing the yard, ignore any whistle that blows 3 short blasts after 2 kylon a.m. We do not schedule movements during night maintenance hours. Rule 9. If you notice an extra car at the end of a parked train that was not present during your previous inspection, do not attempt to identify its reporting number. Do not approach it. Note the discrepancy in the log without investigation. I looked up at Roy, waiting for the punchline. "You guys really lean into the train ghost thing, huh?" His expression didn't change. No smile, no acknowledgement of the absurdity. He just held my gaze with those tired, serious eyes. "We've lost people to carelessness," he said quietly, "and to other things. Follow the rules and log everything. Don't improvise, don't test them, don't assume you know better." "Lost people to other things?" I kept my tone light, still assuming this was some elaborate hazing ritual for new hires. Roy picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Your shift ends at 6 a.m. If you need anything, the emergency line is on the desk. Don't call unless it's genuinely urgent." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "And Ethan? The rules aren't a joke. I can't make that any clearer." Then he was gone, his truck engine starting up outside, taillights joining the others down that dark access road. I stood alone in the control shack, the hum of computers and the distant groan of cooling metal my only company. Through the window, the yard stretched out under sodium lights that flickered and buzzed, casting everything in sickly orange. The rows of parked freight cars looked different now. Not like sleeping giants, but like something else. Like monuments, like tombstones standing in neat lines, marking things buried beneath the gravel and steel. I read through the rules again, more carefully this time. There were 11 total, the normal safety ones interspersed with the strange ones, as if the company wanted them to carry equal weight, as if they expected them to be followed with the same rigid compliance. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the canyon, and somewhere in the yard a loose coupling clanked against steel. The sound echoed, repeating itself down the line of cars, fading slowly. I checked my watch. 12:17 a.m. I had 5 hours and 43 minutes until sunrise. I put on my hard hat, picked up my flashlight and clipboard, and stepped out into the yard to begin my first solo inspection round, the laminated rules folded in my jacket pocket. The cold mountain air hit my lungs sharp and clean, carrying the smell of pine and diesel and old steel. My boots crunched on the gravel ballast as I walked toward the first line of locomotives, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Behind me, the control shack's lights seemed very small and very far away. The rules, I told myself, were probably just accumulated paranoia, the kind of superstition that builds up in any isolated workplace. Every industry has its ghost stories, its warnings passed down from old-timers to new workers. This was probably just the railroad version. Probably. But I kept the rules in my pocket anyway, and I checked my watch more often than I needed to. And when I walked between the towering locomotives, I found myself listening very carefully to the quality of the silence, trying to distinguish between the ordinary sounds of a rail yard at night and something else. Something other. The first 3 hours of my shift passed in what I can only describe as aggressive normalcy. I performed every task exactly as Roy had demonstrated. Checking fluid levels, testing battery voltages, climbing into cold locomotive cabs to verify that systems were properly shut down. Walking the length of each parked train to inspect wheel assemblies and brake lines. I logged every observation on my clipboard with the kind of meticulous detail that would make any supervisor proud. The work itself was calming in a way. There's a meditative quality to repetitive tasks, to the beam of a flashlight revealing familiar shapes, to the scratch of a pen marking checkboxes. The locomotives groaned and ticked as their metal cooled, the sounds echoing through the yard. But these were explicable sounds, mechanical sounds, the kind that made sense. I checked my watch. 1:08 a.m. The temperature had dropped significantly. My breath came out in visible clouds, and frost was beginning to form on the metal surfaces, making everything glitter under my flashlight beam like the yard had been dusted with glass. I'd completed my inspection of the primary maintenance tracks and was walking back toward the control shack to log my findings when I heard it. A train horn, distant but clear, echoes through the canyon. 3 short blasts. I stopped walking, my boots crunching to silence on the gravel. The sound had come from somewhere beyond the yard, deeper in the canyon, maybe near the tunnel entrance. It wasn't particularly unusual. Freight trains used their horns for all kinds of signals, and sound carried strangely in the mountains. But something about it made me reach into my pocket and unfold the laminated rules, angling my flashlight to read them. Rule 7. When crossing the yard, ignore any whistle that blows 3 short blasts after 2:00 a.m. We do not schedule movements during night maintenance hours. I checked my watch again. 1:14 a.m. Not after 2 o'clock. The rule didn't apply yet, and besides, this was 1:14. Trains could be running through the area even if they weren't scheduled to stop at Harrigan Gorge. The main line continued through the tunnel and across the bridge, connecting to the wider freight network. Through traffic wouldn't necessarily appear on my console. The horn sounded again, still those same 3 short blasts, and now that I was standing still and listening carefully, I realized something strange. The sound was clearer this time, closer, but I couldn't hear the underlying rumble of a diesel engine. Trains, especially heavy freight trains, are impossibly loud when they're moving. You hear them coming from miles away, a deep vibration that you feel in your chest before you consciously register the sound. The ground trembles. The rails sing with tension. But the rails beneath my boots were silent and still. I walked toward the main line, the one that led to the tunnel, my curiosity overriding the faint unease that had started to build in my stomach. My flashlight swept across the tracks, catching the gleam of steel rails that stretched into darkness. I stood at the edge of the main line and looked toward the tunnel entrance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, just visible as a deeper shadow against the mountain. No headlight, no approaching train, no sound except the wind. The horn blew again, 3 short blasts, and this time it was unmistakably closer, maybe only a few hundred yards away, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls. I felt my pulse quicken. This didn't make sense. If a train were that close, I should see its headlight. I should feel the vibration through the rails. I should hear the massive diesel engine pulling hundreds of tons of freight. I knelt and placed my palm flat against one of the rails. The metal so cold it burned my skin. In movies, you can hear trains coming through the rails long before you see them, the vibration traveling through the steel. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. The rail was completely still, cold and dead as a grave. I stood up quickly, my heart now hammering for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. The horn did not sound again. The canyon fell back into its usual nighttime symphony of wind and creaking metal and distant water rushing over rocks. But something had changed. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and the sodium lights seemed dimmer than they had moments ago. I backed away from the main line, retreating toward the maintenance tracks, my eyes still scanning the tunnel entrance for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Nothing at all. Back in the control shack, I checked the dispatch system, scrolling through the logs and schedules. No trains were listed as passing through Harrigan Gorge between midnight and 6 a.m. The sensors at the tunnel entrance and bridge exit showed no activity. According to every official source of information available to me, no train had been near the yard tonight. I sat in the creaking office chair and took several deep breaths, forcing myself to think rationally. Sound did strange things in mountain terrain. Echo, refraction, temperature inversions. There were probably a dozen acoustic explanations for why I'd heard a horn that seemed to approach without an accompanying train. Maybe it had come from farther away than I thought, from a train on a completely different line miles distant, the sound bouncing through the canyon in ways that made it seem close. Yes, that made sense. That was rational. I pulled out the laminated rules again and read Rule 7 more carefully. After 2 a.m., the wording was specific, precise, as if the person who'd written it knew that horns might blow before 2 o'clock for ordinary reasons. But after that threshold, something changed. After that time, the horn meant something different. I checked my watch. 1:47 a.m., 13 minutes until the rule took effect, until the boundary between normal and abnormal became official. I'm not sure why I decided to go back outside. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that this was all just a coincidence and an acoustic anomaly. Maybe I was already caught in the gravitational pull of the mystery, unable to resist seeing what would happen when the clock struck 2. Either way, I found myself standing in the yard again at 1:56 a.m., positioned where I could see both the tunnel entrance and the main line, my flashlight off, just watching and listening. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The wind had died down to almost nothing, and the yard was preternaturally quiet, as if something was holding its breath. 2 a.m. arrived without fanfare, just the soft beep of my digital watch marking the hour. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. I started to feel foolish, standing in the cold dark for no reason, like a child afraid of shadows. I was about to head back inside when the horn sounded again. 3 short blasts, impossibly clear, coming from a point that seemed to be directly in front of me, perhaps at the tunnel entrance, perhaps even closer. But there was no headlight, no train, no vibration in the rails, and this time, something else happened. The wind that had been still suddenly rushed through the yard, but it moved wrong, not from any particular direction, but seeming to spiral, to be pulled toward the main line as if the tracks were inhaling. The temperature dropped so quickly that my breath came out in thick clouds, and frost formed instantly on every metal surface, spreading like crystallization in time lapse. The sodium lights flickered, dimmed, and for just a moment went completely dark. In that darkness, I heard something new. The rhythmic clank of wheels on rails, the specific sound of a heavy train moving at speed, growing louder and louder, coming straight toward me from the tunnel. My brain screamed at me to move, to get off the tracks, but my body wouldn't respond because my eyes were showing me something that contradicted what my ears insisted was true. There was nothing there. The tracks were empty. The lights came back on with a buzzing surge, harsh and bright, and the sound cut off instantly as if someone had severed a cable. The wind stopped. The temperature stabilized. Everything returned to normal in the space of a single heartbeat. I stood there shaking, from cold, from fear, from the fundamental wrongness of what I'd just experienced. My flashlight had fallen from my hand at some point, and I knelt to retrieve it from the gravel, my fingers numb and clumsy. The rails, when I looked at them, appeared different somehow. Not in any way I could specifically identify, but they seemed to gleam with a quality that wasn't quite right, as if they were reflecting light from a source I couldn't see. I returned to the control shack at 2:17 a.m., and I did not go back outside until the sky began to lighten at dawn. I sat at the console, logging my earlier inspections, my hands still trembling slightly as I wrote. The rules were spread on the desk in front of me, and I read Rule 7 again and again, as if repetition would reveal some hidden explanation. Ignore any whistle that blows 3 short blasts after 2:00 a.m. Not investigate, not report, ignore, as if the appropriate response to an impossibility was simply to pretend it hadn't happened, to let it pass by unacknowledged like a ghost that only has power if you admit you can see it. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. I needed to believe it. But the rules were not written by people who believed in rational explanations. They were written by people who had learned, probably the hard way, that some things couldn't be explained away, only survived. When Roy arrived at 5:50 a.m., just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, he found me in the control shack. My shift report completed, but my face probably telling a different story. "First night okay?" he asked, pouring himself coffee from the ancient pot. I wanted to tell him about the horn, about the sound of a train that wasn't there, about the lights going out and the wrongness of it all. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the casual way he'd asked, as if he already knew the answer. Maybe it was the fact that the rules existed at all, which meant I hadn't been the first person to experience these things. Maybe I just wasn't ready to admit out loud what I'd witnessed. "Yeah," I said. "Quiet night. Got all the inspections done." Roy nodded, sipping his coffee, his eyes on the yard outside the window. "You read the rules?" "I did." "Good." He set down his mug. Some people don't take them seriously at first. Those people don't usually last long. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask him to. I gathered my things, clocked out, and drove home through the morning light. The mountains beautiful and indifferent, the trees casting long shadows across the road. I told myself I would quit, that I'd call Roy that afternoon and tell him I'd found other employment, that the job wasn't a good fit, that I appreciated the opportunity but had to decline. But I didn't make that call. Instead, I slept fitfully through the day, dreaming of empty rails and phantom horns, and when evening came, I got dressed, got in my truck, and drove back to Harrigan Gorge for my second night. The rules had been tested. They had been validated. And now I knew that whatever was out there in the canyon between the tunnel and the bridge, it was real enough that someone had bothered to write down how to survive it. On my second night, I arrived at the yard with a different mindset. The fear from the previous evening had crystallized into something more manageable. Caution, vigilance, a heightened awareness of time and space. I'd spent the day researching Harrigan Gorge online, finding very little, a few mentions of the rail line's construction in the early 20th century, some historical photos of the tunnel boring, and a brief Wikipedia entry about the bridge spanning the canyon. Nothing about accidents, nothing about deaths, nothing that would explain the rules. The day crew was finishing up when I arrived, and for the first time I noticed how quickly they cleared out, how none of them seemed to linger as the sun dipped toward the mountains. There was an efficiency to their departure that suggested habit, ritual, and an unspoken agreement not to be present after dark. Except for one person. Ty Dawson, the brakeman I'd met briefly the night before, was still in the yard office when I came in to clock on. his boots up on a desk, scrolling through his phone. He was probably my age, maybe a year or two younger, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from either courage or stupidity. I hadn't yet determined which. "Night shift represents," he said, grinning. "How was your first solo run?" "Quiet," I said, a non-answer that was becoming my default. "It's always quiet. That's the beauty of this gig." He swung his boots down and stood, stretching. "Roy give you the haunted railroad speech?" I hesitated. He gave me the rules. Ty laughed, a sound that seemed too loud in the small office. "Oh man, the rules. Yeah, he does that to everyone. It's like his thing. He spooks all the new guys with that creepy list, watches to see if they freak out." "You don't follow them?" "I follow the safety ones, yeah, I'm not stupid, but all that stuff about phantom trains and not walking between cars at spooky o'clock?" He shook his head, still grinning. "Come on, man, it's superstition. Roy's old school. He grew up on stories about railroad ghosts and cursed tunnels and all that folklore stuff. Probably heard it from his dad, who heard it from his dad. The railroad's full of that crap." Something in my chest tightened. Someone wrote those rules for a reason. Yeah, because there was a real accident back in the day, and instead of just saying "be careful," they wrapped it in mystery. Ty grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair. "Look, I've been working this yard for 4 years. Night shifts, day shifts, doubles when we're short-staffed. You know what the scariest thing I've ever seen is? A rusted ladder that broke when I was climbing it. That's it. No ghosts, no phantom trains. Just old equipment and darkness and your brain playing tricks on you." He said it with such certainty, such casual dismissal, that I almost believed him. Almost. "What about Rule 3? I asked. "The one about not walking between coupled cars after 1:37. Ty rolled his eyes. "That's my favorite one, so specific, right? You know why? Back in the 80s, the old night crew used to take smoke breaks at 1:37 on the dot, like it was their tradition or whatever. They didn't want the new guys doing inspections during their break time. So they made up this spooky rule about it being dangerous after that exact time. It's literally just a labor dispute turned into a ghost story." That seems like a stretch. You'd be surprised what gets turned into mythology in a place like this. He headed toward the door, then paused. "You want me to show you? I'm gonna be here for another hour or so, finishing up some paperwork on track 4. When your spooky deadline hits, I'll walk between the cars and wave at you. Nothing will happen. And maybe then you can relax and just do the job without jumping at every shadow." I wanted to tell him that it was a bad idea, that the rules, whether he believed them or not, were clearly meant to be followed. But I also wanted him to be right. I wanted there to be a rational explanation, a mundane origin story for every strange rule on that list. I wanted the horn I'd heard the previous night to be nothing more than acoustic trickery and coincidence. "Your call," I said finally. Ty grinned. "I'll take that as moral support." The next few hours passed unevenly. I conducted my inspections, but I was distracted, constantly aware of where Ty was working, constantly checking my watch. He was in the yard office until about 11:30, then took his clipboard and radio and headed down toward track 4, where a long string of empty hopper cars sat waiting for tomorrow's loading. Track 4 was one of the farther tracks from the control shack, running parallel to the main line but separated by 2 other siding tracks. The hoppers, open-topped freight cars designed for carrying coal or grain, stretched for what looked like a quarter mile, their coupling creating a seemingly endless line of identical rust-red metal. At 1:15 a.m., I was finishing an inspection on track 2 when my radio crackled. "Yo, Ethan, you copy?" Ty's voice relaxed and slightly amused. I keyed the mic. "Copy." I'm at the hoppers, got a sensor alert for an unsecured brake line on one of these cars, maybe 15 units down. Gonna be right at your magic hour. You want to watch and see nothing happen? My stomach tightened. Ty, maybe just wait until after the arbitrary time limit invented by paranoid old-timers? Nah, I'm good. Besides, if something does happen, you'll be close enough to rescue me from the ghost train. The radio clicked off before I could respond. I abandoned my inspection and walked quickly toward track 4, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I could see Ty's light bobbing in the distance, moving along the line of hopper cars. By the time I reached his position, he was standing next to the massive wheels of one car, checking something on his clipboard. 5 minutes to curse a clock, he called out when he saw me approaching. He checked his phone screen. 1:32. Man, the anticipation is killing me. This isn't funny. It kind of is, though. But his smile was strained now, and I wondered if beneath the bravado some part of him was less certain than he pretended to be. The hopper cars loomed above us, their open tops like massive mouths waiting to swallow something. In the darkness, with only our flashlights for illumination, the string of cars seemed to go on forever. Each one identical to the last, creating a disorienting sense of repetition. The coupling between cars looked like interlocked hands, steel knuckles clasped together in an embrace that would require hydraulic force to separate. There, Ty said, pointing to a brake line on one of the hoppers. Looks fine to me, sensors probably just glitchy. I checked my watch, 1:35 a.m. Ty, let's just finish this from the outside. We can inspect the other side from between the cars. That's literally how you inspect brake lines, Ethan. You have to see both sides of the assembly. He moved toward the gap between two hoppers, the space barely wider than his shoulders. Watch this. I'm going to step between the cars at precisely 1:37 and not get grabbed by spooky hands or whatever. Don't. But he was already checking his phone, watching the seconds tick by with theatrical attention. 30 seconds. 20. 10. He looked at me, his expression caught between amusement and something else, something that might have been doubt. You genuinely believe this stuff, don't you? I believe the rules were written for a reason. Yeah, well, I believe in evidence. His phone blinked. 1:37, and here we go. He stepped between the hoppers, slipping sideways into the narrow gap, and disappeared from my line of sight. For a moment, nothing happened. I heard his footsteps on the gravel ballast, heard him moving between the cars to inspect the other side of the brake assembly. My pulse was hammering in my ears, but everything seemed normal, and I felt a wave of relief mixed with embarrassment. Maybe Ty was right. Maybe I was being paranoid. Then the air changed. It happened so suddenly that I almost didn't register it. The ambient sound of the yard, the distant hum of the highway, the rustle of wind through the pine trees, all of it cut out simultaneously, as if someone had pressed a mute button on reality. The silence was total, oppressive, wrong. From between the hoppers, Ty's voice drifted out, but it sounded different now, flattened, as if it were coming from much farther away than it should be. Ethan, did you move something? What? No, come out of there. The cut lever, he said, and now there was an edge to his voice, the first hint of uncertainty. Someone moved the cut lever. The cars are showing uncoupled. That was impossible. The cut lever was the mechanism that separated the air brake system between cars, and it couldn't move itself. More importantly, I was standing right here with a clear view of the outside of both cars. Nobody had touched anything. Ty, get out of there, now! I heard him move, heard gravel shifting under his boots. Then I heard something else. Metal clanking, the specific sound of a coupler settling under weight. The entire line of hoppers shifted just slightly, maybe an inch, but enough that the motion was visible. Enough that every coupling in the line groaned and adjusted. There was no locomotive attached to these cars, no airline was pressurized. Nothing should have caused them to move. Ty! My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and brightening in an irregular pattern. In one of those bright pulses, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Hands. Multiple hands, gripping the bottom rung of the hopper's ladder. Too many hands on one rung. Pressed together, overlapping, the fingers too long and the positions too unnatural. They were there for only a fraction of a second before my flashlight dimmed again, and when the beam steadied, there was nothing. Just empty steel and shadow. Another clank, another tiny shift in the cars, a ripple moving down the line like a shiver. Ty, answer me! Silence between the cars. The oppressive, absolute silence that shouldn't exist in a rail yard. I ran to the gap where he'd entered, shining my light between the hoppers. The space was empty. Gravel, shadows, the underside of the car frames, nothing else. No Ty, no footprints in the ballast leading out the other side. I circled the cars, searching for where he must have exited, my breath coming in rapid clouds. The far side was clear, undisturbed. I ran down the line, checking between each set of cars, finding nothing. His flashlight was gone. His radio was lying in the gravel 15 feet from where he'd entered, still hissing with static, the channel open. I picked it up with shaking hands. Ty, if you can hear me, respond. This isn't funny. No response, just static and the faint, very faint sound of something that might have been breathing, or might have been wind through distant trees. The hopper cars stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened, as if they'd always been exactly as they were now, without a man named Ty Dawson having ever walked between them at 1:37 in the morning. I backed away from track 4, my heart hammering, my mind trying desperately to construct a rational explanation. He'd come out the other side and walk off to play a prank on me. He'd gotten disoriented and gone the wrong direction in the darkness. He'd injured himself and was lying somewhere just out of sight, dazed and quiet. But I knew in the part of my brain that operates below conscious thought that none of those things were true. Rule 3 had a reason, and Ty had learned it. I returned to the control shack at 2:05 a.m., locked the door behind me and pulled up the security camera footage. Harrigan Gorge had several trackside cameras for monitoring operations, and one of them covered track 4. I scrolled back to 1:37 a.m. and watched the grainy black and white playback. There was Ty's figure approaching the hoppers. There I was, standing to the side. I watched him check his phone, watched him step between the cars at exactly 1:37 odd, his form disappearing into the gap. He never came out. The timestamp continued, 1:37:15, 1:37:30, 1:38 on. The space between the cars remained empty. At 1:38:12, my figure entered the frame, approaching the cars, searching. The camera showed me circling, checking, and finding the radio. It showed me standing alone in a yard where, just moments before, there had been 2 people. I watched the footage 3 more times, hoping to see something I'd missed, some angle or shadow that would reveal where Ty had gone. But the video was clear and merciless. He'd stepped between those cars and simply ceased to exist in our reality. At 2:47 a.m., I called Roy's emergency line. It rang 6 times before he answered, his voice rough with sleep. This better be urgent. Ty's gone. A pause. Gone how? He walked between the hopper cars on track 4 at 1:37. I was standing right there. He didn't come out. The pause was longer this time, and when Roy spoke again, his voice had changed, had taken on the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation before. Did you review the camera footage? Yes. And? He just disappears between the cars. The footage shows him going in but never coming out. I heard Roy exhale a long, slow breath. I'll make some calls. Don't go near track 4 for the rest of your shift. Actually, don't go near any of the tracks. Stay in the shack until dawn. I'll be there at 6. What do I tell? Nothing. You tell nobody nothing until I get there. He hung up. I spent the rest of the night in the control shack. The lights on maximum, the door locked, watching the monitors for any sign of movement in the yard. The cameras showed nothing unusual. The tracks remained still. The hoppers on track 4 sat in their long line, rust-red and ordinary, as if they were incapable of harboring anything more sinister than old coal dust. But I knew better now. The rules had been validated again, and this time the validation had consumed a person. The railroad didn't need to show me phantom trains or mysterious lights to prove its danger. It had demonstrated something far more terrifying, the capacity to simply remove people from existence for the crime of not believing, for the sin of testing boundaries that should never be tested. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, I watched the security monitors as Roy's truck pulled into the yard, followed by another vehicle I didn't recognize. They went to track 4 first, spending nearly an hour there, examining the hoppers, searching the area, finding nothing because there was nothing to find. Ty Dawson had stepped between coupled cars at 1:37 a.m., and the railroad had kept him. The rules I now understood with absolute certainty were not suggestions. They were not folklore or superstition or elaborate hazing rituals. They were survival protocols written in blood and validated by absence. And I had just watched one of them claim its proof. The official investigation into Ty Dawson's disappearance lasted 3 days. I was interviewed twice, once by Roy and the rail company's safety coordinator, once by a county sheriff's deputy who seemed deeply skeptical of my account. I told them the truth, or at least the portion of truth that wouldn't make me sound insane. Ty had gone to inspect a brake line. I'd lost sight of him between the cars, and when I'd searched for him, he was gone. His radio had been on the ground. The security footage showed him entering the gap between hoppers but never emerging. What I didn't mention was the silence, the hands I'd glimpsed, the way the cars had shifted with no source of motion, or the fact that Ty had violated Rule 3 at exactly the specified time. Those details I kept to myself, recognizing that they would either be dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations or would lead to questions I couldn't answer without sounding completely unhinged. The rail company's conclusion was predictably bureaucratic. Ty had likely injured himself and become disoriented, wandering off into the canyon in confusion where he'd succumbed to the cold or fallen into the river. Search teams were dispatched to comb the area around the yard, looking for any sign of him. They found nothing. Of course, no footprints leading away from track 4, no disturbed brush, no clothing or blood or any evidence that a human being had passed through that wilderness. After 72 hours, the active search was suspended. Ty's family was notified that their son was missing and presumed dead, though no body had been recovered. The rail yard was briefly shut down, then reopened with a new safety protocol requiring all night shift workers to maintain radio contact every 30 minutes. I was cleared to return to work on my 5th night. They asked if I felt comfortable continuing on the night shift, and I said yes, because saying no would have required explaining my real reasons. And those reasons couldn't be spoken aloud without admitting that I believed the railroad itself had taken Ty, that the rules on the laminated sheet were not metaphorical but literal, and that I was now working in a place where reality operated according to different, darker principles. Roy said very little to me during those days. When I did see him, usually during shift changes, his expression carried a weight that went beyond concern for a missing worker. It was the look of someone who'd witnessed this before, who'd known it was inevitable, and who bore the guilt of having been unable to prevent it despite knowing the danger. On my first night back, he met me in the control shack before the rest of the crew left. We were alone, the low sun casting long shadows through the windows. "You're staying on?" he asked. "For now." He nodded slowly. "I can't tell you what to do, Ethan. I can only tell you that this yard has rules for reasons that go beyond company policy. You've seen that now." "What happened to him?" Roy looked out the window at track 4 where the hopper cars still sat in their silent line. "The same thing that's happened to 6 other people over the years I've been here. The same thing that'll happen to anyone who decides the rules don't apply to them." "Which is what exactly?" "The line takes them." He said it simply, without drama, as if it were just another fact about the yard, like the number of tracks or the depth of the tunnel. "Harrigan Gorge sits on a stretch of rail that's wrong. Has been for decades, maybe longer. We don't control it, we just work around it. There has to be an explanation. There is. Just not one that makes sense to people who aren't here at night." He turned from the window. "I'm going to tell you something that's not in any official record, and if you repeat it, I'll deny saying it. Understood?" I nodded. There were 3 major incidents on this line before it became a maintenance depot. In 1943, a passenger train derailed in the canyon during a winter storm. The locomotive and the first 4 cars went off the trestle bridge into the gorge. Recovery crews could only reach 2 of the cars. The others were too deep in the canyon, pinned under ice and water. 43 people died, and 17 bodies were never recovered. In 1974, a freight train carrying chemical containers jackknifed inside the tunnel. Fire broke out. The tunnel was sealed on both ends to contain it, and it burned for 3 days. When they finally got it open, they found the train had been carrying more cars than the manifest listed. The extra cars were never identified, and no one could explain where they'd come from. In 1992, there was a tunnel fire again. Electrical this time, or that was the official story. It wasn't as bad as 74, but when the crews went in to assess damage, they started reporting problems. Hearing voices in the tunnel. Seeing lights where there shouldn't be any. One crew member claimed he saw people walking along the tracks deeper in the tunnel dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but when he followed them, they vanished. After that incident, they changed this yard from an active station to a maintenance-only depot. Minimize the number of trains that actually pass through. Minimize the number of people who have to work here after dark. "And the rules?" I asked. "They were developed over time by people who survived long enough to notice the patterns. Rule 3 came from an incident in 95. A switchman got caught between cars, except the cars hadn't moved and there was no way he should have been crushed. But he was, after 1:37 a.m., always. That time means something, though I don't know what. Rule 7 came from a dispatcher who kept logging train movements through the canyon that weren't scheduled and never arrived at the next station. 3 short blasts on the horn, always after 2 in the morning. Eventually, she had a breakdown and quit. Rule 9, that one's newer. Started maybe 8 years ago. We'll count the cars on a string at the end of a shift, and by morning there's 1 extra, always at the end. Always unmarked. The few times someone tried to inspect it, they either refused to talk about what they saw or they disappeared. I thought of the smooth, numberless car I'd glimpsed on my first night, the one I'd pretended not to see. Where does it come from? If I knew that, I'd tell you. All I know is that this stretch of rail from the tunnel through the yard to the bridge seems to exist in 2 places at once, here and somewhere else. And sometimes the somewhere else bleeds through. The sun was nearly down now, the yard settling into twilight. Roy picked up his jacket and keys. "There are more rules than what's on the sheet," he said. "Unwritten ones, learned through experience. I'll tell you one now. If you ever hear your own voice on the radio, your actual voice, then saying things you haven't said, kill the power to every channel and stay away from the main line until sunrise. Whatever's out there, it learns, it mimics, it tries to get you to respond, to engage with it. Why don't they just shut down this yard, tear up the tracks? Roy smiled, but there was no humor in it. Because the railroad is like a circulatory system, Ethan. You shut down one vein, the blood finds another route. Whatever's stuck on this line, it would just move somewhere else. At least here we know the rules. At least here we can manage it, contain it. Someplace new? He shook his head. It'd be a slaughter before people figured out what they were dealing with. He left, and I was alone in the yard as night fell, with only the rules and Roy's words for comfort. I didn't begin my inspection rounds immediately. Instead, I spent the first hour exploring the control shack more thoroughly than I had before, searching through file cabinets and storage boxes for any additional information about the yard's history. I found it in a back cabinet under a pile of outdated track diagrams, a collection of old logbooks, incident reports, and personal notebooks left behind by previous night shift workers. The incident reports were clinically written but deeply disturbing. Disappearances, unexplained injuries, workers who'd quit suddenly after experiencing stress-related episodes. Patterns emerged. Most incidents occurred between 1:30 and 4 a.m. Most involved violations of the rules, though the reports used bureaucratic language like failure to follow safety protocols, and none had ever been satisfactorily explained. More revealing were the personal notebooks. One labeled F. Turner, Night Foreman, 1988-1996, was filled with observations written in tight, increasingly frantic handwriting. June 12, 1989. Heard a horn from the tunnel, 2:14 a.m. No train on schedule. Checked main line. Rails cold. Horn repeated 3 times. Did not investigate. Equipment check is normal. August 3, 1989. Worker J. Simmons reported seeing a headlight in the canyon with no engine sound. Refused to approach tracks for the remainder of the shift. Filed no formal report per my instruction. October 17, 1991. Count discrepancy on track 3. Crew counted 23 hoppers at shift start. I counted 24 at 3:47 a.m. Extra car at the end of the string. No reporting marks. Surface appears smooth, uniform, and wrong. Did not approach. The count returned to 23 by dawn. March 4th, 1992. Tunnel fire. Official cause listed as electrical. Actual observation, crew entering for inspection reported seeing a train inside that wasn't on any manifest, older style cars, some still burning, though the main fire was out 3 days ago. The crew refused to continue. Union got them transferred. New crew brought in. Found nothing unusual. Don't know what that means. November 8th, 1995. Lost Davies tonight. Walked between cars on track 6, 1:39 a.m. Never came out. Security footage confirms. This is the third one. Rule 3 added to the official list. The entries continued for years, documenting the slow accumulation of rules, the gradual understanding that the yard operated according to principles that had nothing to do with railroading and everything to do with survival. Turner's final entry, dated March 1996, was just 2 lines. Can't do this anymore. The line wants something from us, and I don't think we can give it enough to make it stop. There were other notebooks, too, from other workers, other eras. One from the 1970s included a hand-drawn map of the yard and the line beyond, with the tunnel and bridge circled and annotated in faded ink. Something stuck between here and there. The line isn't empty. A train that never finished its run. I spread the map on the desk, studying it. The main line ran from the tunnel through the yard and across the trestle bridge, continuing on to connect with the broader freight network. But someone had drawn additional lines in red ink, showing what looked like an overlay. A second path that looped back on itself, connecting the tunnel to the bridge and back to the tunnel again, forming a closed circuit. Beneath the drawing, a single sentence. It's trying to complete its route. I sat back, my mind racing. The accidents Roy had mentioned, the derailment, the tunnel fires, the unexplained cars. What if they hadn't been separate incidents but parts of a single event? A train that had crashed or burned or been lost and was now trapped in some half-state, trying endlessly to finish a journey it had started decades ago. And what if that ghostly train occasionally intersected with our reality here in the yard, where the living and the lost occupied the same physical space but in different temporal dimensions? It sounded insane. It was insane. But it was the only explanation that accounted for everything I'd experienced, everything documented in these notebooks, everything encoded in the rules. At 1:15 a.m., I forced myself to leave the control shack and begin my inspection rounds. The yard felt different now, charged with significance, every shadow potentially hiding something that had bled through from the other side. I checked locomotives, logged numbers, and tested brake lines, all while constantly monitoring the time and my position relative to the rules. At 2:30 a.m., while inspecting a line of tanker cars on Track 2, I saw it. Track 4, the hopper line where Ty had disappeared, now had one additional car at the end of the string. I was certain, absolutely certain, that when I'd walked past at 11:45 there had been 42 hoppers. Now there were 43. The extra car was at the far end, partially obscured by shadow despite the sodium lights. Even from a distance I could see that its surface was wrong, too smooth, too uniform, lacking the patina of rust and wear that covered every other car in the yard. It didn't look old or new. It looked like something trying to remember what a freight car should look like and getting the details almost, but not quite right. Rule 9. If you notice an extra car at the end of a parked train that was not present during your previous inspection, do not attempt to identify its reporting number. Do not approach it. Note the discrepancy in the log without investigation. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the car, half expecting it to move or transform or do something overtly threatening. It did none of those things. It simply sat there, coupled to the legitimate cars, a passenger from another reality taking up space in ours. Back in the control shack, I logged the discrepancy in my shift report, using the bland language of bureaucracy. Track 4 hopper count discrepancy noted. An additional unit was observed at 02:35 hours. No action taken per Rule 9. I wondered how many of these reports existed in filing cabinets somewhere. How many night workers over the decades had noted these same impossible observations in the same careful neutral language, creating an archive of the supernatural buried in mundane paperwork. The rest of the night passed without further incident unless you counted the constant low-level dread that had become my baseline emotional state. At dawn, I checked Track 4 again from a safe distance. 42 hoppers, just as there should be. The extra car had vanished, returned to wherever it came from, its brief intrusion into our world complete. When Roy arrived, I showed him my log entry. He read it without expression, then nodded. "It's happening more often," he said quietly. "When I started here, the extra car showed up maybe once a month. Now it's twice a week, like it's getting stronger or more desperate." Desperate for what? Roy looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something that terrified me more than the phantom cars or phantom horns or any of the rest of it. Uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. "And that's what scares me most." I didn't sleep well after that shift. My small rental house in the mountain town, 20 miles from Harrigan Gorge, felt too quiet, too empty, and every creak of settling wood or rattle of wind against windows jerked me awake, my heart pounding, expecting to hear 3 short blasts of a train horn echoing through impossible distances. When I finally gave up on sleep around noon, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, searching for anything I could find about the rail line, the tunnel, the bridge, and the history of accidents and disappearances. The internet offered surprisingly little. The 1943 derailment was mentioned in a few historical railroad accident databases with bare facts. 43 dead, several cars unrecovered. Investigation concluded it was a combination of weather and track conditions. The 1974 tunnel incident appeared in some news archives described as a freight derailment with subsequent fire, with no mention of extra cars or unexplained phenomena. The 1992 event didn't appear at all in any searchable records, as if it had been deliberately scrubbed or classified under some other designation. I found one interesting detail. Though a digitized railroad workers' journal from the 1930s written by a tunnel engineer during the original construction of the bore through the mountain. One entry dated September 1934 caught my attention. The men are superstitious about the tunnel. They say the mountain doesn't want to be pierced, that there are places inside where compasses spin and lights fail for no reason. 2 workers have quit, claiming they heard voices speaking from deep inside unfinished sections. I've told them it's just echo and their own nerves, but I confess the tunnel does feel wrong in certain places, as if the rock resents our intrusion. So the strangeness predated the accidents. Maybe it had always been there, latent in the geology or the specific location, and the tunnel had simply opened a door to it, or released something that had been contained. Or maybe the act of boring through the mountain had created the wrongness, had damaged something fundamental about that place in ways that couldn't be undone. I drove back to the yard that evening with a sense of inevitability. I could quit, should quit, but I knew I wouldn't. Partly because I needed the money and jobs were scarce, but mostly because I needed to understand. The mystery had hooks in me now, deeper than fear. And walking away would mean living the rest of my life knowing that there was a place in Idaho where reality bent around an unsolved tragedy, where the dead and the lost persisted in their routines, and I would never know why or how or what it meant. When I arrived, Roy was waiting for me in the yard office, which was unusual. Normally, he'd be coordinating the tail end of the day shift, making sure everything was secured before the crew departed. Instead, he was sitting at the desk, his hands folded in front of him, his expression grave. "Close the door," he said. I did and sat down across from him. "I talked to corporate," Roy said, "about Ty, about the pattern of incidents, about whether it's time to seriously consider shutting down night operations at this yard." "What did they say?" "They said night maintenance is essential for keeping the through line operational. They said our safety record, statistically speaking, is within acceptable parameters. They said Ty's disappearance, while tragic, appears to be the result of individual negligence and doesn't reflect systemic problems." "Acceptable parameters," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. Roy smiled without humor. "Corporate doesn't see what we see. They look at spreadsheets and incident reports written in careful language that makes everything sound mundane. They don't stand in the yard at 2 in the morning listening to trains that aren't there. They don't watch cars multiply or disappear. They don't make the connection between the rules and the reasons. Then why do they keep the rules posted? Insurance, legal protection. If someone gets hurt or killed and they didn't follow the posted safety guidelines, the company isn't liable. The rules look weird, sure, but they're vague enough that a lawyer could argue they're just overly cautious procedures, not admissions that we're working in a haunted rail yard." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Which is why I'm telling you this off the record. Corporate doesn't care about protecting us. They care about protecting the line. As long as trains can pass through this corridor, even if it's only a few scheduled freights per week, they'll keep the yard open and they'll keep sending people to work here at night. What happens to those people is less important than maintaining the route." "That's insane. That's business." Roy pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to me. "This is everything I've compiled over the years. copies of incident reports, personal accounts, and the history I told you about the accidents. It's not complete. A lot of records have been lost or deliberately destroyed, but it's more than what's officially acknowledged. I want you to have it. Why me? Because you're smart enough to take the rules seriously but curious enough to want answers. And because he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I'm getting old, Ethan. I've been the night supervisor here for 12 years, and before that I worked day shifts for 8. That's 20 years of managing this thing, of watching it get worse, of writing rules in the hope that they'll keep people alive. I'm tired. I'm thinking about retiring next year, and when I do, someone needs to understand what this yard really is. Someone needs to be able to warn the next person. The weight of what he was offering, or burdening me with, settled onto my shoulders. The rules aren't enough, are they? Even if everyone followed them perfectly. No, Roy admitted. They're not. They're just delays. Ways to minimize contact, to reduce the overlap between our reality and whatever exists on that line. But the thing itself, the source of it all, is still out there, still trying. Trying to do what? Roy stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard as the day shift workers climbed into their vehicles and began the exodus. Come with me. There's something I need to show you before it gets dark. We took Roy's truck, driving past the yard entrance and onto a narrow service road that paralleled the main line toward the tunnel entrance. The road was barely maintained, more of a track than a proper route, winding through dense pine forest. After about 10 minutes, Roy pulled off onto an even smaller path and parked. We walk from here, he said. He led me through the trees, following what looked like an old footpath, until we emerged on a rocky outcrop overlooking the rail line. From this vantage point, I could see the tunnel entrance perhaps 200 yards away, a perfectly circular void in the mountainside, with the single track running straight into darkness. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the tunnel mouth looked like an eye, dark and watching. The tunnel's almost 2 miles long, Roy said, standing beside me. Cuts straight through the mountain, comes out on the far side where the line continues east. Standard engineering for the era. Nothing unusual about the construction itself. But 3 months after it opened in 1937, workers started reporting problems. Lights are failing inside for no reason, equipment malfunctioning, sounds that didn't match any natural echo. The railroad company sent engineers to investigate. They found some minor structural issues, fixed them, and declared everything safe. The problems continued. Roy pulled a folded map from his jacket pocket and spread it on a flat rock. It was a topographical map of the area, with the rail line drawn in red ink, the tunnel a straight red line through the mountain. Here's what they didn't investigate, he said, pointing to the mountain itself. The geology. This mountain is mostly granite and schist, standard for the Idaho batholith. But right here, where the tunnel passes through, there's an inclusion. A formation of different rock, probably limestone, maybe 50 yards across. It shows up in the geological surveys, but nobody thought it was significant. Why does that matter? Limestone caves easily. It's porous, full of voids and chambers. And this particular inclusion has something else. He traced a line on the map, running roughly parallel to the tunnel but offset by about 30 yards. An old mining shaft, silver prospecting from the 1890s, abandoned after they hit water. The shaft intersects with natural caves in the limestone, and those caves... He paused. The surveys from the 1930s suggest they might intersect with the tunnel or come very close. I studied the map, beginning to understand. You think the tunnel breached something it shouldn't have? I think when they blasted through that section, they opened a connection to something that was already there. A void space, a cave system, something old and deep. And I think that space had... characteristics that we don't fully understand, properties that affect how reality works in its proximity. That sounds like science fiction. It sounds like the best explanation I've got, Roy said flatly. Caves are liminal spaces, Ethan. Thresholds between the surface world and whatever's below. Humans have treated them as sacred or cursed for millennia. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe some caves are thin places where the membrane between different states of existence is permeable. He refolded the map. The 1943 derailment? The train went off the bridge on the far side of the tunnel after passing through. Some survivors reported that the train had seemed to accelerate inside the tunnel, that the engineer had lost control. The 1974 incident started inside the tunnel, and the fire burned in ways that didn't make sense, hotter than it should have been, spreading against the ventilation. The 1992 event, crews reported that the air inside the tunnel felt wrong, that they saw things that couldn't be there. After that, the company minimized traffic through the tunnel, scheduled only essential through freights all during daylight hours, turned this yard into a maintenance depot instead of an active junction. But the phenomena didn't stop. No, because it's not about the trains themselves, it's about the space. The tunnel, the yard, the bridge, they're all part of the same contaminated corridor. And whatever happened in those accidents, whatever lives or machines were lost, they left an imprint. A recording maybe, or a fragment of consciousness trapped in a loop trying endlessly to complete a journey that was interrupted. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the tunnel entrance. A raven called from the trees behind us, harsh and sudden, making me jump. "There's one more thing," Roy said. "A verbal rule that's not written down anywhere because putting it in writing would require explaining too much. If you ever hear your own voice on the radio, your actual voice, not someone else calling your name, but your voice saying things you haven't said, kill the power to every channel and stay away from the main line until sunrise." You mentioned that before. Why? What does it mean? It means the thing in the line has noticed you specifically. It's not just mimicking random sounds anymore. It's mimicking you, which means it's trying to establish a connection, to draw you in, to make you part of its pattern. Roy's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear beneath it. It's happened 3 times that I know of. Twice, the worker had the sense to follow the rule, shut down their radio, and survive the night. The 3rd time, he shook his head. We found his radio still transmitting, lying on the tracks near the bridge. He was gone. And for 2 hours after we recovered the radio, it kept broadcasting his voice, talking about how he could see the lights of the train coming, how it was beautiful, how he needed to flag it in, even though he was already gone. The sun was sinking toward the mountains now, the shadows lengthening, and the tunnel mouth seemed to grow darker, deeper, more like a throat than an eye. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked. "Because you're going to see things out there, Ethan. Things that will make you doubt your sanity. Things that will tempt you to investigate, to approach, to engage. And I need you to understand that engaging with it is the worst thing you can do. The rules work because they create distance, boundaries. They keep us separate from it. The moment you cross those boundaries, the moment you answer the voice on the radio or approach the extra car or walk between the hoppers at the wrong time, you're permitting it to pull you in." He started walking back toward the truck, and I followed, my mind reeling with implications and questions. As we drove back to the yard, the sun finally set, and by the time we arrived, full darkness had fallen, and the sodium lights were flickering on, casting their sickly orange glow over the tracks. "One last thing," Roy said as I got out of the truck. "If the computer ever prompts you to line in a train, to set the switches and signals to receive a freight, check the consist information carefully. If the railroad company name has not existed in your lifetime, if the unit numbers don't match modern formats, don't line the route. Override the system, lock the switches manually if you have to, but do not create a path for that train to enter this yard. What happens if I do? I don't know. No one's been stupid enough to try it, but I think... He paused, staring out at the dark yard. I think that's what it wants. To finish the route. To pull into a station and discharge its passengers and freight, to complete the journey that was interrupted. And if it does that, if it succeeds in fully manifesting here, I don't know if it'll go away afterward or if it'll just keep coming over and over, Braze, using this yard as its terminal forever. He drove away, leaving me alone in the yard office with the folder of documentation, the rules, and a growing certainty that I was caught in something much larger and older than I'd imagined. The night stretched ahead of me, full of hours that had to be survived, full of rules that had to be followed, and somewhere beyond the sodium lights and the neat rows of silent freight cars, something waited in the darkness, patient and hungry and endlessly trying to come home. The next few nights established a new rhythm, a routine built around hypervigilance and controlled paranoia. I learned the timing of the phenomena. The phantom horn usually sounded between 2 and 3 a.m. The extra car appeared most frequently around 2:30, and the period between 1:30 and 2 a.m. seemed to be when the boundary between realities was thinnest, when the yard felt most charged with wrongness. I planned my inspection rounds to minimize exposure during those hours, staying close to the control shack, working on paperwork or equipment maintenance that didn't require me to venture deep into the rows of parked trains. I followed every rule with religious precision. I never walked between coupled cars after 1:37, even when it would have been the most efficient path. I ignored the horn when it blew its 3 short blasts, keeping my eyes away from the canyon, focusing on my work. When I noticed the extra car at the end of track 4, which I did 3 times over the next week, I logged it without approaching, treating it like a weather phenomenon, noting its presence the way you'd note fog or rain. The rules became a kind of armor, a protective ritual. As long as I followed them, I could move through the yard with relative confidence, trusting that the phenomena would remain at a distance, observing but not touching. It was a cold comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. Then on my 9th night, everything changed. The shift began normally. I arrived at 6, overlapped with Roy for the handoff, and conducted my preliminary inspections as the day crew departed. The weather was clear, the temperature dropping quickly as it always did once the sun set behind the mountains. By midnight, I'd completed my first full round of equipment checks and was in the control shack, updating logs and drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm in the cup. At 1:47 a.m., my radio crackled to life. "Ethan, you there, man?" I froze, the coffee cup halfway to my mouth. The voice was unmistakably Ty's, same intonation, same casual drawl, even the same slightly amused undertone that had characterized all his speech. For a moment, my brain tried to construct a rational explanation. Maybe he'd survived somehow, had been injured and wandering in the wilderness, had found his way back. Maybe the last week had been a misunderstanding, a series of coincidences that had made me believe he'd been taken when really he'd just been lost. Then reality reasserted itself. Ty had disappeared 9 days ago. Search teams had found no trace of him. And even if he had somehow survived, how would he have had a working radio? How would he sound completely healthy, uninjured, as if nothing had happened? "Ethan, come on, answer me." A pause, and now there was an edge of concern in the voice. "I know you're on shift. I can see the lights on in the shack." I set down the coffee cup carefully, my hand trembling slightly. This was wrong. This was a violation of something fundamental. But it sounded so much like him, so perfectly mimicked, that part of my brain insisted on believing it was real. "Look, I need help, man. I'm out by the tunnel. Signal's bad out here. Something's wrong with the main line. I think there's a train stuck inside the tunnel, but it's not showing on the system. Can you check your console?" I looked at the computer monitors. The tunnel sensors showed no activity, no obstruction, no temperature changes that would indicate a locomotive inside. The main line was clear. "Ethan, you're worrying me, dude. If there's a train stuck in there and we don't respond, this is going to be a massive problem. I need you to confirm what you're seeing on your end." The voice was patient, reasonable, and expressed exactly the right amount of concern. If I hadn't known, if I hadn't seen Ty disappear, if I hadn't read Roy's warning, I would have responded. I would have keyed the mic and said I was checking, and whatever was using Ty's voice would have established a connection, would have drawn me into conversation, and then, I didn't know what would happen then. But Rule 7 and Roy's verbal warning were clear. Do not engage with voices on the radio that aren't supposed to be there. I reached for the radio not to answer, but to check which channel the transmission was coming on. It was channel 3, the primary yard frequency, but when I looked at the radio itself, the display showed no incoming signal indicator, no transmission light. The radio was receiving sound, but according to its own electronics, no one was broadcasting. "All right, man. I'm going to walk the line into the tunnel, see if I can spot the problem from inside. But I need you to stay on the radio with me, okay? In case I lose signal completely. Just key up every few minutes so I know you're there." The voice paused, and in that pause I heard something that made my skin crawl. Breathing that didn't quite match the rhythm of speech, as if the breathing and the words were being generated by different sources and layered imperfectly. "Ethan, please, man. I don't want to go in there alone." The last sentence was delivered with perfect vulnerability, the tone of a friend genuinely frightened and seeking reassurance. It was masterful, really. If I'd had any remaining doubt about what I was dealing with, that sentence demolished it. The thing on the radio knew exactly which emotional buttons to press, exactly how to construct an appeal that would be almost impossible to refuse. I turned the radio volume down to 0 and set it on the desk, watching its display. For several minutes, the lights continued to indicate non-existent transmissions, the voice presumably still talking, still trying to elicit a response. Then the lights went dark, the transmission ending. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. I had passed some kind of test, had refused the bait, and I had no idea what consequences that refusal might carry. At 2:05 a.m. the radio came to life again, and this time the voice was different. It was my voice. "Control Shack, this is Ethan. I'm out at track 6 and I need someone to verify something for me. Can anyone hear this?" I stared at the radio, my pulse hammering in my ears. The voice was mine. Not similar, not a good impression, but precisely exactly mine, with every subtle inflection and vocal characteristic that makes a voice unique. It was as if someone had recorded me and was playing it back, except I'd never said those words, never made that radio call. "I'm seeing something weird out here. There's a headlight in the canyon, but it's not moving. I think there might be a stalled train, but I'm not getting any response from the crew. Requesting backup at track 6. Roy's warning echoed in my mind. If you ever hear your own voice on the radio, kill the power to every channel and stay away from the main line until sunrise. I flipped the power switch on the radio, cutting it off mid-transmission. The sudden silence was deafening. I sat in the control shack, my breath coming quick and shallow, feeling the weight of what had just happened. It had tried Ty's voice first, testing whether emotional appeal would work. When I hadn't responded, it had escalated using my own voice, creating a situation where I would normally be obligated to respond. A worker calling for backup is not something you ignore in a safety-critical environment. It was learning, adapting, and trying different approaches to get me to engage. and it had specifically mentioned Track 6, which meant it wanted me to go there. Whatever was waiting at Track 6, I had been successfully warned away from by my refusal to answer. But then at 2:23 a.m., the situation became more complicated. The control shack's landline phone rang, startling me badly enough that I nearly knocked over my cold coffee. The phone was an old desk model connected to the railroad's internal network used for shift communications and emergency calls. I stared at it for 3 rings, my hand hovering over the receiver, uncertain. It could be Roy, calling to check on me. It could be the dispatcher from the regional office confirming some administrative detail. It could be a legitimate call. On the 4th ring, I picked up. Harrigan Gorge Maintenance, this is Ethan. Static hissed on the line, and under it I could hear something that might have been breathing or wind or the distant sound of machinery. Then a voice, faint and distorted. Ethan, it's Ty. I'm in the tunnel. Signal dropped. Gotta walk the train out. It's stalled. Need you at the bridge to flag us in. We're rolling blind here. If you don't flag us, we're going off the bridge. My hand tightened on the phone. The voice was barely audible through the static, but it was recognizable as Ty's. And the scenario made a horrible kind of sense. A stalled train inside the tunnel, trying to complete its passage through to the bridge, needing someone to set signals and confirm the route was clear. Except there was no train in the tunnel. The sensors confirmed it, the schedule confirmed it. And even if there were, Ty was gone, had been gone for over a week. Can you hear me? The voice was breaking up, desperate. Ethan, if you're there, please, we're rolling now. We can't stop. We need clearance at the bridge or we're going to... I heard something in the background of the call. The rhythmic clank of wheels on rails, the groan of metal under stress. Sounds that were absolutely convincing in their authenticity. Ethan, please. This was the crux of it. The moral trap perfectly designed to catch someone with a conscience. If there was even a chance, even a remote possibility, that a real train was in danger, that real people might die because I refused to respond, could I live with that? But I'd seen the footage of Ty disappearing. I'd read the reports of other workers lost to this thing. I knew with as much certainty as I could have about anything that this was not a legitimate emergency. And yet, the doubt was there, planted expertly, growing like ice in my chest. What if I was wrong? What if my paranoia had made me unable to distinguish between the supernatural and the real? What if I ignored this call and people died? I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think clearly. If there were truly a train in danger, there would be other indicators. The tunnel sensors would show heat signatures. The rail pressure monitors would register weight. The automated safety systems would have triggered alarms. None of that had happened. Every objective measurement said the tunnel was empty. Ethan, we're approaching the bridge. Flag us in. I heard it then beneath the voice, beneath the static. My own breathing slightly out of sync, as if someone were standing very close to the phone on the other end, listening and breathing in rhythm with me. It wasn't on the line with me. It was mirroring me, using my presence to strengthen its transmission, feeding off my attention and fear to make itself more real. I hung up the phone. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the phone began ringing again, insistent, demanding. I unplugged it from the wall jack. The silence that followed felt accusatory, as if I'd committed an unforgivable sin by refusing to help. I sat in the control shack, my hands shaking, telling myself over and over that I'd made the right choice, that the rules existed for exactly this reason, that engaging with the phenomena was how people got killed. But the doubt remained, a small voice whispering that maybe I'd just condemned people to death through inaction. At 2:45 a.m. I heard it, a train horn, distant but clear, coming from the direction of the tunnel. Not 3 short blasts this time, but one long, continuous blast, the kind that signals emergency, the kind that means something has gone catastrophically wrong. I looked at the monitors. No activity in the tunnel. No train approaching the yard. The rails were cold and empty. The horn blew again, that same desperate, continuous blast, and I could hear something else now. A rumbling, growing louder. The unmistakable sound of a heavy train moving at speed, coming through the tunnel and out into the canyon. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to run outside and see what was happening, to confirm whether the emergency was real. But I forced myself to stay in the chair, to keep my eyes on the monitors, to trust the sensors over my ears. The sound grew deafening, as if the train were passing directly outside the control shack, mere feet away. The building vibrated, coffee sloshed in my cup, papers fluttered on the desk. And then, silence, sudden and complete, as if someone had flipped a switch. I checked the monitors again. Nothing. No train had passed through the yard, no sensors had been triggered. No rails showed the heat signature of recent contact with heavy wheels. But when I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw something that made my heart drop into my stomach. Every light in the yard was on maximum, the sodium lights burning so bright they washed out all shadow, and the yard itself was empty and still, except for the main line, where the rails were glowing faintly as if they'd been heated by friction, cooling slowly back to normal. Something had passed through using the rails, present enough to heat the metal but not substantial enough to trigger any sensors. The thing in the line had tried to manifest, and I had refused to provide the final element it needed. Acknowledgement, engagement, the cooperation of a living person to complete the circuit. I'd passed the test. But I'd also escalated the situation. Whatever was out there now knew I could resist its appeals, which meant it would either give up or try something more aggressive. I spent the rest of the shift in the control shack, doors locked, radio and phone disconnected, watching the monitors and waiting for dawn. When Roy arrived at 5:50, he took one look at me and knew immediately that something significant had happened. "Tell me," he said. I told him everything. The voice using Ty, the voice using me, the phone call, the phantom emergency, the sound of a train that wasn't there, heating the rails as it passed through. Roy listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively grimmer. When I finished, he walked to the window and stared out at the yard for a long moment. "It's never done that before," he said quietly. "Used the phone. Created an extended scenario with multiple contact attempts. That's new." "What does it mean?" "It means it's getting more sophisticated, more desperate, more willing to invest effort in trying to draw someone in." He turned back to me. "And it means you're incredibly lucky you followed the rules. If you'd answered that call, if you'd gone out to the bridge..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I almost did," I admitted. "I almost convinced myself it might be real. That's what it counts on. The doubt, the conscience, the fear of being wrong." Roy sat down heavily in the other chair. "You did the right thing, Ethan. You followed the rules even when it was hard. That's why you're still here." But I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. And the only reason I'd survived was blind adherence to guidelines I didn't fully understand, written by people who'd learned their lessons through tragedy. The sun rose over the mountains, beautiful and indifferent, and the yard returned to its daytime self, a place of steel and diesel and ordinary human labor. But I knew now that the normalcy was just a thin veneer, that beneath it, or rather overlapping it in some dimension I couldn't perceive, was something else, something that never stopped trying, that grew stronger and more focused with each passing year. And I knew that sooner or later, it would find a way to complete what it had started. I seriously considered quitting after that night. I'd saved enough money to cover a few months of expenses, enough time to find another job, even if it paid less. The rational part of my brain, the part concerned with self-preservation, was screaming at me to walk away from Harrigan Gorge and never return. But I didn't quit. I showed up the next evening and the evening after that, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was stubbornness, a refusal to be driven away by fear. Maybe it was morbid fascination, the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at accident scenes. Or maybe, as Roy had suggested, I'd become the person who needed to understand, who needed to document, who needed to be the repository of knowledge for when the next inevitable incident occurred. The next 3 nights were quiet, or as quiet as Harrigan Gorge ever got. The phenomena continued in their usual patterns, the distant horn after 2 a.m., the occasional extra car appearing and disappearing, the sense of being watched from the darkness beyond the sodium lights. But there were no voices on the radio, no phantom phone calls, no attempts to engage me directly. It was as if the thing in the line was regrouping, conserving energy, preparing for another attempt. Roy spent more time with me during the overlaps, sharing stories from his 2 decades at the yard, filling in details about workers who'd left abruptly, incidents that had been officially explained away but that everyone who worked nights knew were something else. He told me about a dispatcher who'd seen the same phantom train on the security cameras 3 nights in a row and had quit via text message on the 4th day. About a mechanic who'd started sleepwalking toward the tunnel and had to be physically restrained by co-workers. About a supervisor who'd become obsessed with figuring out the pattern, who'd spent his nights taking measurements and recordings, and who'd eventually been found wandering the tracks at dawn, unable to remember the previous 8 hours. The thing is, Roy said during one of these conversations, it doesn't want to hurt us, not directly. I think it wants to be acknowledged, validated. It wants someone to complete its pattern, to let it finish what it started. The danger comes from when we resist, when we refuse to play our part. That's when it gets creative. Reassuring, I said dryly. Just keep following the rules. They've kept me alive for 2 decades. They'll keep you alive too. He paused. Unless it changes the game. On my 13th night, it changed the game. I should have known something was different from the moment I arrived. The air felt heavier, charged with an electric quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. The day crew left earlier than usual, with several workers citing equipment issues or not feeling well. Excuses that Roy accepted without question, as if he could sense it too, that tonight was going to be different. "You want me to stay?" Roy asked as the last truck departed. It was unusual for him to offer. Supervisors didn't typically work double shifts without serious cause. "I'll be fine," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Radio me if anything happens, anything at all, no matter how small." He left, and I began my shift under skies that seemed darker than usual, as if the stars had dimmed or the mountains had grown taller, blocking out more of the heavens. The first few hours were normal. I completed my standard rounds, checking locomotives and logging numbers, the routine physical work keeping my anxiety at bay. But I noticed small things. Frost forming in patterns on metal surfaces that looked almost like writing, though I couldn't decipher any actual words. Shadows that seemed slightly wrong, extending in directions that didn't match the light sources. A raven sitting on top of a boxcar at 11:30 p.m., watching me with uncomfortable intensity until I threw a rock near it, and it finally flew away. At 1:15 a.m., I was in the control shack completing paperwork when every light in the yard flickered simultaneously. Not a power surge. The computer systems didn't reset or show any electrical anomaly, just a momentary dimming, as if something had passed between the lights and the ground, casting a shadow over everything at once. I checked the monitors. All sensors showed normal. No movement in the yard, no activity at the tunnel or bridge. At 1:37 a.m., I was careful to be inside the shack, away from any coupled cars, door locked. I'd learned my lesson from watching Ty. The minute hand on the wall clock crawled past 1:37 and nothing happened. No sounds, no phenomena, no sense of wrongness beyond the baseline wrongness that was always present. But at 2 a.m. exactly, the computer console came to life with a notification I'd never seen before. Incoming consist, main line to yard, prepare to receive freight 713. Origin Mountain Pacific Railroad Units 23, status priority clearance required. I stared at the screen, my mouth going dry. Mountain Pacific Railroad. I'd seen that name in the historical documents. It was one of the companies that had operated this line in the 1940s before a series of mergers and acquisitions had consolidated it into the current corporate structure. Mountain Pacific hadn't existed as an entity for at least 60 years. The system was prompting me to set the switches to line the main line into Track 4 to create a route for this non-existent train to enter the yard. This was it. This was what Roy had warned me about. The test. I checked the tunnel sensors. No activity, no train was actually approaching. But the computer insisted otherwise, the prompt blinking with increasing urgency, and now I could hear it. A distant rumble, the unmistakable sound of a heavy diesel engine pulling freight, growing louder, coming through the tunnel. Clearance required train. Approaching yard limit, set switches for Track 4 reception. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Every safety protocol I'd ever learned said that when a train is approaching, you set the route. You don't question the computer system, you don't second-guess the sensors, you create a safe path and let the train come through. But this wasn't a real train. It couldn't be. The company didn't exist. The consistent number didn't match modern formats. The sensors showed nothing. And yet the sound was undeniable now. The deep thrumming vibration of a locomotive, the rhythmic clank of wheels on rails coming closer and closer, emerging from the tunnel. Priority clearance required train. Entering yard limit, set switches immediately. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the tunnel entrance. And there it was, a headlight, brilliant white, piercing the darkness of the canyon, pointed straight toward the yard. As I watched, the locomotive emerged from the tunnel mouth, massive and dark, its headlight washing over the rocks and trees. But the light was wrong. It didn't cast proper shadows. Objects in its glare seemed to flatten, lose dimension, as if the light weren't reflecting off them but passing through them. And I couldn't see the locomotive itself, just the light, moving along the tracks at a steady speed, accompanied by sound but not substance. Final warning, clearance required. The computer had never used final warning language before. I didn't even know it was programmed to do so. The headlight was approaching the yard entrance, perhaps 30 seconds away. If this were a real train and the switches weren't set, it would either trigger automatic safeties and stop, or, if those systems failed, it would potentially derail, smashing into the yard in an uncontrolled wreck. If it were a real train. I thought of all the rules, all the warnings, all the people who'd been lost to this thing because they'd engaged with it, because they'd acknowledged it, because they'd done what it wanted. I thought of Roy's words. If it succeeds in fully manifesting here, I don't know if it'll go away afterward or if it'll just keep coming, over and over, using this yard as its terminal forever. The headlight was 20 seconds away, so bright now that the entire yard was washed in white light, shadows retreating, every detail visible in stark clarity. I made my choice. I killed the power to the switch control system, physically flipping the breaker on the wall panel. Then I grabbed the manual override key from its hook, ran outside into the cold night air, and sprinted to the switch junction where the main line could be routed into the yard tracks. The switch was controlled by a simple mechanical lever when the power was off. I reached it, grabbed the lever, and held it firmly in the position that kept the main line straight through, that prevented any diversion into track 4. The headlight was 10 seconds away, bearing down on me, so bright I had to squint, so intense it felt like standing in front of a sun. I held the lever. 5 seconds. The sound was deafening now. The roar of an engine that couldn't possibly exist. The scream of metal on metal, the rush of wind and displacement. 3 seconds. I could see it now in the light. Not a train, but the suggestion of a train. A ghost image of freight cars skewed at impossible angles, some derailed, some burning with flames that didn't move. Frozen in the moment of catastrophe. I could see figures pressed against windows, mouths open in silent screams, hands reaching out. I could see a locomotive with a crumpled nose and a cab filled with shadows that might have been smoke or might have been something worse. 1 second. The light hit me, passed through me, and for one eternal instant I was inside it, inside the frozen moment of the wreck, experiencing the terror and confusion and desperate last thoughts of 43 people dying in winter darkness, the train leaving the rails, the weightless moment before impact, the knowledge that nothing could be done, that this was how it ended. Then it was past. The light snapped off. The sound cut out. The vibration in the rails ceased instantly. I was standing alone at the switch junction, my hand still gripping the lever, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The yard was dark again, lit only by the sodium lights, normal and quiet and empty. I looked down at the rails where the train should have passed. They were cold. No heat signature, no disturbance, nothing. I'd held the line. I'd refused entry. I'd kept the boundary intact. I walked back to the control shack on shaking legs, restored power to the switch controls, and checked the monitors. Everything was normal. The computer console had cleared its urgent messages, showing only the standard status displays. But when I looked at the timestamp of the incident, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The entire event, from the first computer prompt to the moment the light passed through me, had lasted exactly 1 minute and 43 seconds. 1:43. 1 minute for each person who died in the 1943 derailment. The pattern was there, embedded in the timing, another piece of evidence that this wasn't random haunting but something structured, something that followed its own internal logic. I sat in the control shack for the rest of the night, too wired to do any meaningful work, just watching the monitors and waiting for another attempt. But nothing else happened. The phenomenon had made its strongest play and had been refused, and now it was quiet, retreating back into whatever space it occupied, waiting for another opportunity. Roy arrived at dawn to find me still at the desk, the manual override key still in my pocket and my hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline hangover. "Something happened," he said. It wasn't a question. I told him everything, from the computer prompt to the light passing through me, from the frozen moment of the wreck to the significant timing. Roy listened, his face growing pale, and when I finished, he sat down heavily. "It tried to come in," he said quietly. "It actually tried to manifest physically. That's never happened before, not in all the years I've been here." "Why now? What's changed?" "I don't know. Maybe it's getting stronger. Maybe we're approaching some anniversary or convergence that matters to it. Maybe it's just a random fluctuation." He looked at me. "But you stopped it. You held the line. That's significant." "It felt like I was there," I said, still processing the experience. "In the wreck. Like I was experiencing what they experienced when they died." "Maybe you were. Maybe that's what it is. Not a ghost train, but a recorded moment, a trauma so intense it left an imprint on that stretch of rail. And it keeps trying to play out, to complete itself, because that's what traumatic patterns do. They repeat." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun rise over the mountains, turning the yard gold and peaceful. as if nothing terrible had ever happened there or ever would. "I'm going to recommend we increase staffing," Roy said finally. "2 people on night shift instead of 1. After this, I don't think anyone should be out here alone." "Will corporate approve that?" "Probably not, but I'm going to try anyway." He stood up, gathering his things. "Take tomorrow night off. You've earned it. Hell, take the rest of the week off if you need to." "I'll be here tomorrow," I said. Roy nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Of course you will." I did take that night off mostly because my body demanded it. The adrenaline crash hit me around noon, and I slept for 14 hours straight, dreamless and heavy. When I woke, it was evening again, and my phone showed 3 missed calls from Roy and a text message. Corporate denied the staffing increase. Safety record doesn't justify additional labor costs. I tried. I'm sorry I wasn't surprised. The rail company had made it clear through both action and inaction that maintaining the line was more important than protecting the workers who maintained it. We were acceptable losses factored into the cost-benefit analysis, worth less than the expense of scheduling an additional shift. I returned to work the following night with a strange mix of emotions. Fear, certainly, but also a kind of fatalistic acceptance. I'd survived the worst the yard could throw at me, had directly refused entry to the thing that haunted this stretch of rail, and I was still alive. That had to count for something. The next week passed in relative quiet, the phenomena returning to their usual patterns. The horn in the canyon, the extra car, the sense of being watched. All were present but muted, as if the force behind them had been weakened by its failed manifestation attempt. I followed the rules with mechanical precision, treating each night as a series of checkboxes to complete. Arrive, log in, inspect equipment, avoid track 4 after 1:37, ignore the horn, note discrepancies without investigating, and leave at dawn. But I noticed changes in myself. I was sleeping poorly on my nights off, jolting awake at sounds that resembled train horns. I found myself checking the time obsessively, tracking how close I was to 1:37 or 2 Komodin, the danger hours. I'd become hypersensitive to patterns, seeing significance in the most mundane coincidences. 3 cars passing on the highway in sequence, a flickering light that blinked exactly 43 times before stabilizing. Roy noticed too. He started spending more time with me during shift changes, not saying much, just being present, offering the silent support of someone who understood what it was like to carry this burden. He brought me better coffee, shared his dinner sometimes, made small talk about normal things, sports, weather, local news, deliberately creating pockets of ordinary humanity in a place that felt increasingly divorced from ordinary reality. "You're doing good work," he told me one evening. "Better than most. Some people crack after their first real encounter. You've had several and you're still here, still functional. That takes strength." "Or stupidity," I said. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He smiled, but it was sad. "I'm putting in my retirement paperwork next month. 20 years is enough. More than enough." "What will you do?" "Move somewhere flat. Somewhere you can see for miles in every direction. Somewhere without tunnels or canyons or trains." He looked out at the yard. "Somewhere I can stop listening for horns that shouldn't exist." His retirement felt like a countdown, a marker of my own trajectory. How long could I do this? How many nights of controlled terror could a person endure before something inside them broke? On my 17th night, I found something that suggested I wasn't the first to ask those questions. I was conducting a late inspection near the maintenance shop, checking a line of locomotives that were queued for service, when I noticed a gap between 2 units. Not the usual coupling gap, but a wider space, as if something had been removed. Curious, I squeezed through and found myself in a narrow alley between the shop wall and a parked freight car, a space probably created accidentally by decades of equipment repositioning. There, scratched into the corrugated metal of the shop wall, were names and dates. J. Turner, 1996, Riley, 2003, Mahoney, 2007, T. Patterson, 2011, C. Valdez, 2014, Dawson, 2025. Below them, in fresher scratches, someone had added, "Rules aren't enough. Nothing is enough. It wants to finish. We're just in its way." I stood there for a long time, staring at the names, recognizing some from the incident reports I'd read. These were the people who'd been taken, who disappeared into the gaps between cars or walked toward phantom trains or answered voices they shouldn't have answered. Someone, probably Turner, the night foreman from the 1990s, had started this informal memorial, and others had continued it, documenting the cost of keeping this yard operational. Ty's name was there, freshly scratched, and I wondered who'd added it. Roy, probably, the only other person who would have known, who would have understood the significance. I pulled my pocket knife and after a moment's hesitation added my own name at the bottom. E. Cole. 2025. Survived. It felt important to document survival as well as loss, to mark that some of us made it through, that following the rules actually worked. But even as I carved the letters, I wondered how long that survival would last. Whether survived was just a temporary state that would eventually be corrected. That same night, at approximately 3 a.m., I noticed something I'd somehow missed in all my previous shifts. A small junction box mounted on the wall of the control shack, painted the same color as the wall, easily overlooked. It was labeled in faded text, "Mainline signal override, emergency use only." I opened it curious and found a simple switch in the off position, with a handwritten note taped inside the box. "If you need to keep something out, flip this. It will close all signals on the main line for 12 hours. You'll catch hell from dispatch, but you'll be alive to catch it." F. Turner again, the night foreman who'd survived 16 years before finally quitting. He'd left this hidden failsafe, a last resort option for when the rules weren't enough, when something needed to be actively prevented from entering the yard. I left the switch in the off position but took a photo of the note with my phone, another piece of documentation, another fragment of accumulated knowledge. The pattern was becoming clear. Survival here was about the accumulation of knowledge, about each generation of night workers learning the rules and adding to them, documenting what worked and what didn't, creating an informal survival manual that existed outside official channels. The company didn't protect us, so we protected each other across time, leaving warnings and tools for whoever came next. At the end of that shift, I compiled my own document, a detailed account of everything I'd experienced, everything Roy had told me, everything I'd found in the logbooks and notebooks. I saved it in multiple locations, my laptop, a USB drive, my phone, and emailed it to myself. If something happened to me, if I became another name scratched on that hidden wall, at least there would be a record, a guide for whoever replaced me. Roy saw me doing this during a shift change and nodded approvingly. "Smart," he said. "Knowledge is the only weapon we have against this thing. The more we understand, the better we can avoid it." Do we understand it, though? Really? He thought about that. We understand its patterns, its rules, its boundaries. We don't understand what it is or why it exists, or what it ultimately wants. But we understand enough to survive it most of the time, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. As the weeks passed and I settled into a grim routine, I noticed one final thing that both reassured and disturbed me. The extra car at the end of Track 4 was appearing less frequently. Where it had been showing up 3 or 4 times a week when I started, now it appeared maybe once a week, and when it did appear, it seemed less solid, more translucent, as if it were fading. Roy confirmed that the other phenomena seemed to be declining as well. Fewer phantom horn blasts, less frequent railroad manifestations. Either my refusal to line the route had weakened it, or it was simply in a natural ebb cycle, conserving energy for its next major attempt. "Don't let your guard down," Roy warned. "This is when people get comfortable, when they start to think the danger has passed, and that's when it gets them." He was right, of course. Complacency was its own danger, maybe more insidious than the supernatural threat itself. So I continued to follow every rule, to treat each shift with the same cautious vigilance, to never assume that quiet meant safe. But I also allowed myself to hope, just slightly, that I might actually survive this job long enough to quit on my own terms, to walk away with my life and sanity intact, to join Roy in some place flat and far away where trains were just machines that carried freight from one place to another, nothing more. On my 20th night, I found a new addition to the hidden memorial wall. Someone, and it could only have been Roy, had scratched a line beneath my name. Held the line. Refused entry. Kept us safe. It was the closest thing to recognition or thanks I was likely to receive for that night when I'd stood at the switch junction and refused to let the phantom train into the yard. The company would never acknowledge what I'd done. There would be no commendation, no bonus, no official record of the incident. But Roy knew. And whoever came after me would know, would see my name in the note and understand that resistance was possible, that the thing in the line could be refused, that the patterns could be broken. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a place like Harrigan Gorge, where the normal rules of reality bent around trauma and loss, where the dead persisted in their routines and tried endlessly to finish journeys that had ended in catastrophe, sometimes something was all you could ask for. I continued my shift, checking locomotives and logging numbers, following the rules that kept me safe, adding my own small observations to the accumulated knowledge of decades, playing my part in the long, quiet war between the living and whatever haunted that stretch of rail. The sun would rise, as it always did, turning the yard back into a place of steel and diesel and ordinary human labor. And tomorrow night I would return because that's what the job required. Because someone had to stand watch. Because the line needed to be held. Roy's retirement became official in early spring. There was no ceremony, no company recognition of his 2 decades of service. Just paperwork processed by distant offices, a final paycheck, and the quiet end of an era. On his last night, he met me in the yard office during shift change, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. 2 people who'd shared something that couldn't be adequately expressed in words. "I updated the master copy of the rules," he said eventually, pulling out the laminated sheet I'd first seen on my arrival. It looked different now. There were 11 rules instead of the original 9, the additions written in Roy's neat handwriting and freshly laminated over. Rule 11. If the computer system prompts you to line in a train from a railroad company that no longer exists, do not set the route. Override the system, lock the switches manually if necessary, but do not create a path for it to enter the yard. Rule 12. If you observe the extra car at the end of track 4 more than 3 times in a single shift, evacuate to your vehicle and monitor from a safe distance until dawn. Something is trying to establish a stronger presence. "My contributions," Roy said, "based on what you experienced, so the next person has better information." "You're really leaving," I said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of something I was still processing. "I'm really leaving. I've stayed too long already." Started dreaming about it, Ethan. The wreck, the tunnel, the people in the windows. That's when you know it's time, when it starts following you home. He looked at me, his expression serious. Don't let it get that far. Work here for the money. Learn what you need to learn and then get out. Don't end up like me, giving it 20 years. Someone has to do the job. Someone, yes, but not the same someone forever. We're not meant to carry this alone for that long. He stood, gathering his personal items from the office, a coffee mug, a jacket, a few photographs of grandchildren I'd never heard him mention. They're bringing in my replacement. A kid named Logan, mid-20s, just got his railroad certification. He seems eager, maybe too eager. You talked to him about the rules? I'll brief him tomorrow during his orientation, but you know how it is. Nobody really believes until they experience it themselves. Roy paused at the door. Watch out for him if you can. Not your responsibility, but watch out for him anyway. After Roy left, I spent my shift trying to process what his absence would mean. He'd been the institutional knowledge, the living link to decades of documented phenomena, the person who could answer questions and provide context. Without him, I was the senior night worker despite having been there less than 2 months. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like physical pressure. The night was quiet, phenomenon-wise. Just the usual distant horn and the ever-present sense of being observed. I completed my rounds, updated my personal documentation, and added a new entry to the hidden memorial wall. R. Matheson, 1996-2025, kept us alive, earned his rest. 2 weeks later, Logan arrived for his first shift. He was everything Roy had described. Young, enthusiastic, full of that specific confidence that comes from technical training but no real-world experience. He had the new employee eagerness to please, asking constant questions about procedures and equipment, taking meticulous notes on everything I showed him. We overlapped for 3 shifts while he learned the basics, and during those nights I tried to prepare him the way Roy had prepared me. I showed him the inspection routes, the equipment logs, and the emergency procedures, and on the 3rd night I handed him the laminated rules. Read these before midnight, I said. They're more important than they look. Logan read through them, and I watched his expression change from professional interest to confusion to amused skepticism. It was like watching a replay of my own first reaction. These are interesting, he said, choosing his words carefully. Probably not wanting to offend the senior worker on his first week. The company really keeps these posted. Some of them are pretty weird. They keep them posted because they work. Follow them exactly even when they don't make sense. Sure, yeah, of course. But I could hear the doubt in his voice, the unspoken assumption that these were just quirky traditions, folklore that the old-timers took too seriously. I wanted to tell him about Ty, about the light at the switch junction, about the names on the hidden wall. But I remembered Roy's words. Nobody really believes until they experience it themselves. Pushing too hard would just make him dismiss me as paranoid, which would reduce my credibility when it came to actual safety instruction. So I did what Roy had done for me. I gave him the rules, emphasized their importance, and hoped he'd be smart enough to follow them before learning why they existed the hard way. On Logan's first solo night, I stayed late, off the clock, just sitting in my truck in the parking area within sight of the yard. I told myself I was just being cautious, making sure he had my number in case of emergency. But really, I was worried. I'd seen what happened when people didn't take the rules seriously. Around 2:30 a.m., my phone rang, Logan's number. "Everything okay?" I answered. "Yeah, fine, just quick question." He sounded uncertain. The confidence from earlier in the week had diminished. That rule about the horn, the 3 short blasts after 2 a.m. My stomach tightened. What about it? I heard it like exactly 3 short blasts, maybe 20 minutes ago. And I know it says to ignore it, but I walked over to where I could see the canyon, and Ethan. There's a light out there. Just sitting in one place, not moving, but it's definitely a train headlight. Should I report it to dispatch or... No, I interrupted. Don't report it. Just note it in your log if you want, but don't investigate, don't approach the tracks, and definitely don't try to figure out where it's coming from. That's what the rule means. A pause. But what if there's actually a train out there in trouble? There isn't. The sensors would show it. The schedule would show it. What you're seeing is... I tried to find words that wouldn't sound insane. It's a known phenomenon. Acoustic anomaly, light refraction, whatever you want to call it. It happens here, just let it be. That seems like a pretty significant safety issue that should be reported to Logan. I made my voice firm, authoritative. I know it seems wrong to ignore it. I know every instinct says to investigate. But that rule exists for a specific reason, and people have been hurt when they didn't follow it. Trust me on this. Just ignore it and continue your normal rounds. Another pause, longer this time. Then, okay, if you say so, I wanted to check. You did the right thing by calling. Keep me updated if anything else unusual happens. We hung up and I sat in my truck watching the yard through the windshield, my hands tight on the steering wheel. He'd followed the rule, but reluctantly with doubt. That doubt was dangerous. It was what had killed Ty. It was what the thing in the line exploited. I stayed in the parking area until dawn, watching Logan complete his shift, ready to intervene if necessary. Nothing else happened that night. He finished his inspection rounds, logged out at 6 a.m., and drove away, probably writing the whole experience off as veteran workers being overly superstitious. Over the next week, Logan had 2 more encounters with the phenomenon, the extra car appearing on track 4 and what he described as weird vibrations in the rails that don't match any equipment running. Each time he called me with questions, and each time I told him to follow the rules, to document but not investigate, to maintain distance. I could hear his frustration growing, could sense that he thought the rules were preventing him from doing his job properly, that ignoring obvious safety issues went against everything his training had taught him. On Logan's 8th night, I wasn't there. I'd taken a rare night off, driving into Boise to handle some personal business, trying to maintain some connection to the world beyond Harrigan Gorge. I should have been there. I should have known that he'd reached the critical threshold where doubt and frustration would override caution. My phone rang at 2:47 a.m., Logan's number. I answered immediately. "Ethan, hey, sorry to bother you on your night off, but I need some advice." His voice was strained, excited, and nervous. "Remember that extra car that shows up on track 4? I've been thinking about it, and I reviewed the security footage from the past week, and I think I figured out what's happening. There's a gap in the camera coverage, like a blind spot, right at the end of that track. I think someone's been moving cars manually, maybe for some maintenance reason that's not getting logged properly." My blood ran cold. "Logan, where are you right now?" "I'm at track 4. I'm going to check the car's reporting numbers. Get them into the system properly so we can..." "No. Listen to me very carefully. Get away from that car right now. Don't approach it. Don't try to identify it. Get back to the control shack immediately." "What? Why? If it's just a logging error, I can fix it in 5 minutes." "It's not a logging error. Rule 9 exists specifically because of that car. Do not approach it." "Ethan, come on. With all respect, I think you guys have built up this mythology around normal rail yard stuff. And while I appreciate the tradition, I have a job to do. I'm going to..." "Logan, I'm begging you. As someone who has worked there longer, who has seen what happens when people break the rules, do not approach that car. I'm just going to get the reporting number. I'll be fine. Look, I'll call you back in a few minutes, okay?" The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately. No answer. I tried 4 more times while throwing on clothes and running to my truck. No answer. I broke every speed limit on the drive back to Harrigan Gorge, my heart hammering, my mind playing through every possible scenario. I arrived at the yard at 3:35 a.m., my truck skidding to a stop in the gravel parking area. The yard was quiet, lit by the sodium lights, appearing completely normal. I ran to track 4, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The string of hopper cars looked exactly as it always did. I counted them. 42. No extra car. Logan's work truck was parked nearby, driver's door open, radio lying on the ground still hissing with static. But no Logan. I searched the area for 40 minutes, calling his name, checking between cars, examining every shadow. Nothing. He'd simply vanished, the same way Ty had vanished, the same way all the names on that hidden wall had vanished. At 4:20 a.m., I called Roy. He answered on the second ring, immediately alert despite the hour. "The new kid?" he asked when I'd explained. "Yeah." A long silence. Then, "I'll make the calls. You write up what happened. Exactly what happened, including the calls where you warned him. Corporate's going to want documentation." Roy, I tried to stop him. I tried. "I know you did. It's not your fault, Ethan. He made his choice, just like Ty made his choice. We can warn people, but we can't force them to believe." The investigation followed the same pattern as Ty's disappearance. Interviews, searches, and official conclusions that Logan had likely injured himself and wandered into the wilderness. The rail company updated its safety protocols again, adding more frequent check-in requirements. And I added another name to the hidden memorial wall. Logan Vance, 2025, didn't believe standing there in the narrow alley between the shop wall and the freight car. Looking at the growing list of names, I understood with absolute clarity what Roy had meant about not staying too long. This place consumed people, not just those who broke the rules, but also those who had to watch them break the rules, who had to live with the guilt of not being able to save them. I made a decision that night. I would stay for 6 more months, just long enough to train whoever replaced Logan, to pass on the knowledge and warnings as Roy had passed them to me. And then I would leave, would find some ordinary job in some ordinary place where the worst dangers were workplace accidents and failed equipment, where the dead stayed buried and trains were just machines. But even as I made that decision, I knew I'd always carry Harrigan Gorge with me. I'd always check the time compulsively at 1:37 and 2:00. I'd always listen for 3 short blasts when I heard train horns. I'd always remember the light at the switch junction, the voices on the radio, the names on the wall. Some things, once experienced, can never be forgotten. 2 weeks after Logan's disappearance, the railroad company posted another job listing. Night locomotive technician needed. Remote Idaho facility, competitive pay. Minimal supervision. Experience preferred. And somewhere, someone desperate for work. Someone who needed the money and didn't mind isolation. Someone who would read the posting and think, trains are kind of cool, would apply. And the cycle would continue. Because the railroad is like a circulatory system and you can't just shut down one vein. The line has to be maintained. The freight has to move. And someone has to stand watch in the dark hours, following rules they don't understand, protecting boundaries they can't see. Keeping something hungry and patient and endlessly persistent from finishing what it started decades ago. I updated the rule sheet one final time before my shift ended, adding what I'd learned. Rule 13. When training new workers, emphasize that the rules are non-negotiable. Explain that skepticism is dangerous. Share what you've witnessed, even if it sounds insane. Some will believe and survive. Some won't believe and will join the names on the hidden wall. But you must try. I laminated the new sheet and posted it in the control shack, next to Roy's updated version, creating a permanent record of accumulated knowledge bought with blood and absence. Then I began my rounds, checking locomotives and logging numbers, following the rules that kept me alive, waiting for dawn and the next person who would need to be taught that some places are wrong in ways that can't be rationalized away, that some dangers persist beyond death, and that survival sometimes means simply believing in things you don't understand and following rules that make no sense. Because at Harrigan Gorge Yard, in the darkness between the tunnel and the bridge, something was still trying to finish its journey. And we, the living, were all that stood between it and completion.